distance casting is a really important part of my armoury. I don't do it all the time, but I have done it quite a lot in the past, in places like Rockford and Burfield and some of the big, vast, open expanses of water that I've fished. Now, in the last few years, I've not really fished too many waters like that, and the biggest chuck has been about 100 yards, something like that. But now I find myself on Brasenose 1 down in the Linear complex, and it's a fairly big chunk of water. It's about 30 acres, I'd say, and I think out in the centre it's about 135 yards. So it is quite important to be able to distance cast, because the fish do tend to be showing out there, especially at the minute. As I sit here, I must have seen 20 or 30 shows in the last 20 minutes. They're going absolutely nuts out there. So being able to get a lead to them is really, really important. Now, technique is a major part of that. How I cast and how I've learnt to cast over the years is quite important. But I'll come to that later, and I'll show you the technique that I use. But also the kit is vitally important. Now, to start off with, the rods I'm using are a brilliant bit of kit. You've got to have quite a fast action rod in order to get that quick tip recovery speed, but enough backbone in order to propel that lead out there with a decent amount of force. Now, I prefer 13-foot rods, so any day of the week, if I'm distance casting, I would take a 13-foot rod over a 12. And the reason for that is the extra foot of length creates so much more speed in the tip, enabling you to really propel that lead and really get some speed into it. These rods I'm using today are Prologic Inspires in 3.75 test curve. They've got a nice bit of backbone from punching the lead out a long way, but they've still got a nice bit of action in the tip, which is quite important for when you get a fish under the rod tip. And the last thing you want is trying to play them on a broom handle where you've just got no give whatsoever. So these rods really are quite nice, both for pushing the lead out there and playing a fish. The reels are quite important as well. You've got to have a reel with excellent line lay. I can remember back in the day when I started fishing, and line lay was terrible. There was so many dips and trops, and the line just crossed each other, and it was nowhere near as good as what some of the reels on the market I've got now. The reels I'm using are the Okumas, the 8K from Okuma, and it's got a long elongated spool on it, very slow oscillation, and the line lay is absolutely awesome. It looks like it's been painted on there, and when you give it the big hit, you can just literally see the line just peeling off, and you can barely hear it coming off as well, which is a good sign that there's limited friction. It's got good cranking speed as well, so when you continue casting and miscasting and bringing the leads in from a long distance out, you're not winding forever like some of the old-fashioned reels were. So yeah, a good line lay and a big spool is also vitally important for distance casting. The next important thing is line. Now, if I'm going for out and out distance, sort of 150 yards plus, then I'll go braid. I'll go to the finest braid possible. I'll get a big shock leader, so a 50, 60 pound braided shock leader, which also helps no end. Because if you've got a braided shock leader, you're not losing any distance by having the line stretched behind you like mono can. So with a braided shock leader, you're getting every ounce of that lead into the cast and banging it out there. But today, I'm only going 130 yards, so there's no need for that. I'm just using a mono line straight through. And it's quite a substantial mono as well. It's rated at 18 pounds, and the diameter is 0.37 millimeters. So it's not exactly a thin line, it's quite a chunky line. But because it's quite supple, it's quite soft, and it's very smooth, it casts really well. And I'm having no problems hitting 130 in these sort of conditions. So if you're unsure about braids and your water doesn't allow braids, you can still do those sort of distances with a thick mono without a shock leader, which a lot of waters are banning shock leaders these days. So don't try and do 130 yards with a 10 pound line that's 0.30, because the chances are you're going to get crack offs, and that's the last thing you want. So a substantial line helps, but it has to be supple, and it has to be smooth, and it has to fly off the spool fantastically well to cut down friction, so you can maximise the distance. Leads are also vitally important as well. Because of my casting style, I find that I can get a substantial amount further with a 4.5 or even a 5 ounce lead than I can a 4. I've got quite a slow winding up casting style, and I use my height, because I'm 6'4", to put behind the cast. So I find a 4.5 ounce lead is perfect for me, really, and I can generate a slow bit of power, but once it's propelled out there, it just shoots the rig out there. But different people have different casting styles, and somebody who's got quite a punchy casting style and uses the speed of the arms maybe a 4-ounce lead might suit you a little bit better. So it's trial and error a little bit to see what suits you, but definitely a 4.5 suits me. Rig wise, I try to use fairly stiff materials in the rig because I'm putting these rigs a long way out towards the centre of the lake, so I don't want any chances of tangles. So I tend to use a coated braid, but a reasonably stiff coated braid. The last thing I want is a really supple braid, because that can frap up quite easily. And the last thing you want is to have your rig out there all night and just bring it into a tangle, which is cost you the chance of a bite. And once you've got your rigs out there, bite indication is quite important as well. I like to fish my bobbins fairly high, putting all the way to the top. So I'll get sort of 1 beep as it goes to the rod tip, and 2 or 3 beeps as it comes out the line clip if it's a forward bite. And I like to set my clutches fairly light if I'm fishing mono at range, especially if there's no weed around or any sort of snags or anything like that. But what I find is sometimes if you're fishing locked up and really tight, you can get a long time between your first couple of beeps as it tightens up and then before the line starts going off the clutch. And what that is, it's a lot of stretch. You can imagine a mono line that can stretch up to 20% or even beyond 20%. That's a lot of stretch when you've got 130 yards of line out there. So I like to set my clutches fairly light so it rips off. If there's weed, fair dues, I'll fish things fairly tight, because the last thing I want is them bashing through a few weed beds and limiting the chance of me landing them. But if it's a clear water like this, I tend to fish it fairly light. Like I say, with the bobbins, with a few centimetres before it hits the rod tip, but I've got plenty of drop back potential as well. So if the fish comes towards me, it can drop all the way back. So bite indication is vitally important, and the last thing I want to be doing at that sort of range is fishing slack or semi-slack lines. So combine all these things together, and distance casting really will bring you a few extra fish. Well, a powerful spot and marker rod is really important for my fishing at long range. I need something that can propel a lead right out there so I can find the spots I want to fish over. And this setup was doing it quite easily. I was banging it right out there to the centre, initially with a bare lead, just trying to find the spot I wanted. Where I first intended to fish, right out in the middle, it was quite sludgy and quite silty, and every time I was having to pull the lead out of the silt, and I decided that wasn't really the spot I wanted to fish. So the best hard spot I could find was about 120 yards, where I found a nice bit of gravel, and every time I cast the lead onto it I got a nice crack down, so I know it's a nice solid area, which suggests to me it's an area that fish have fed on in the past. So the rod's vitally important for the marker work and for the spotting work as well. This rod is the Element Spod and Marker rod. It's a 5-pound test, so it's got a lot of backbone to put an AirBomb or a Spomb out there a long way. I mean, these are quite heavy when they're fully laden to bait. They can be up to 6 ounces, so we really do need something with a fair bit of backbone to push it out to 120, 130, even 140 yards. The reel I'm using is the Okuma 8K. I love just the size of the spool, the line lay on it, the slow oscillation, and it's got quite a lot of crank power as well in the handle, so you're not really working hard to bring it back across the water. Well, the line I'm using is a fine braid. Just because it takes next to no drag when it's coming off the reel, it just absolutely peels off like there's nothing there, and cuts down very little distance. As you can see, I'm using a shock leader with it as well. This is a 50-pound shock leader, which is needed to absorb that initial hit. The fine braid just won't stand up to the heavy resistance of an AirBomb, a Spomb, or a heavy lead being cast. You need something to absorb all that shock, and this 50-pound leader does that job perfectly. Well, I didn't get a great deal of sleep last night because the fish out there were really, really active all night, and they were moving around the lake as well. You know, there was a big pod of fish right out in the centre of the lake yesterday afternoon, as I mentioned earlier. I'd put a rod on it at about 135 yards, and nothing really happened. But as the evening wore on a little bit, the fish moved in a little bit closer, and they were right over mating in the swim next door, probably about 100 yards out. And then slowly, as it got dark, they drifted this way, and they were more or less out in front of me, but quite close in, probably about 50, 60 yards. So I moved the long rod, put it on top of the fish, and hope for the best. I tried to keep the two other rods on the baited area at 120 yards, and I pretty much tried everything to catch those fish. I had a couple of single hook baits, just there on the deck. Then I switched to a zig. Then I moved the zig around as the fish moved from my right to my left, all across here. But it was just hard work, and I finally gave up about 1 o'clock in the morning and let the rods fish themselves. And then at 2 o'clock, the middle rod was away. I had a tearing take, stopped, dropped back an inch or two. By the time I got to the rod, it hit the top again and shot off. So I bent into the fish, and it was quite a wild fight. It was ploughing up and down in front of me, and it managed to go through the two remaining lines. And I got in a right mess with the right hand rod. It twisted right around the rod, and I was just trying to bring it in, just trying to get it close to the net. I could see it just wallowing on the surface in the dark, and then just as I was a few inches away from the net, it was still around the other line, so it was difficult to pull the big weight back. But just as I was probably a couple of yards away from the net, the hook pulled, and everything just fell slack. And yeah, I had to do all three rods with no reward of a fish at the end, so it was a bit disappointing. So not a great deal of sleep last night. But I woke up this morning and not a great deal's happening. There's a few fish still showing out there, but they've dotted around. You know, one showed right in the margins down here, a couple more out towards the centre, but they're not showing like they was earlier. So I've moved the zig, and I put the zig right out in the centre, pretty close to where I think the fish are going to back off, because it really is busy at the minute down here. So yeah, I've got the zig right out in the centre, and about half an hour ago it tightened up out of the clip and then started to drop back, and I struck into nothing. So a bit of an aborted take on a zig, but you get that on zigs. So I've got about 4 or 5 hours left to try and produce a fish. We'll see what happens. Technique is vitally important with distance casting. Now everybody's got a slightly different technique and different casting styles. Some people are very punchy and punch with their arms. I use my height and my body weight in order to get the maximum into the rod and get the maximum compression and just sail it out there as far as I can. Now one thing's worth mentioning, I didn't mention it previously, but it's very, very important to get a rod with a fast tip recovery speed. And these Inspires have pack bay minima guides, so the guides are really, really light at the top end of the rod, which allows the rod to straighten very quickly, and that increases the amount of distance you can get and also the accuracy. If you can imagine a rod that's flipping and flopping around after you cast like the old-fashioned rods from back in the 90s, then you're going to lose a lot of distance through that. But these rods straighten very quickly, so you don't lose a great deal of distance. Now the technique I use for long distance casting is I always wet the spool and wet all the rings, and that just aids lubrication going through the eyes of the rod, and lubrication as it flies off the spool. That minimises friction drastically, and it stops a lot of frap ups as well on the butt ring and through the other eyes. So I'll bring the lead up, which is a 4.5 ounce distance lead, to somewhere around the spigot. Open the bail on, make sure that's fully locked off. And we do a quick check, just make sure it's not frapped around. Now, what I do here is I extend my right arm as far as it can. So I'm creating a fulcrum. And then what I need to concentrate on doing then is push a little bit with this arm, but pull down with this hand here. So I'm pulling this hand right into my chest in order to fire the rod round. But I'm going to use my full weight and my height to push this lead out. So previously, I was only fishing at 120 and I didn't really need to do this. I can generally just do it with a little lean and push it forward. But I'm going to extend my arm, lift my foot up and just step forward and just crack into the cast and just bring it all down and hopefully propel that lead out to the centre of the lake. Now it's important to get a side-on stance for this. So you're standing side on, arms in the air, and I'm going to lean forward and pull the rod through. So let me just check and I'll demonstrate it for you now. Another important thing is as you go through the cast, try not to dip the rod too low. Especially don't let it hit the water, because as soon as it goes too low and hits the water, that will slow the lead down immeasurably. So try and cast and stop the rod about here. And then as all the lines peeling through the eyes, try and keep it up at a 45-degree angle. And then it's pointing straight, more or less where the trajectory of the line is flying out of the rings, and that will cut down resistance to a minimal and let you get that extra few yards. Right over matey next door. Hopefully don't get a cross line. This one was right off the baited spot. Little yellow boilie, essential pop-up. Fished over, I don't know, but it's in about 5k bait over the last 24 hours. I was pretty sure I was getting done yesterday. I had a bit of an aborted tape. Just dropped back all the way to the bottom. I'm sure they was going in there and cleaning me out, but just feeding carefully so that we didn't get a pickup, because the lake's quite busy at the minute with a lot of people on furlough. I'm sure there's absolutely loads and loads of bait going out there, and probably more than we actually need. So I didn't go over the top. I just probably spotted 3 or 4 times over the last 24 hours just to keep a bit in there, so if they are coming through, at least they're picking the odd bit up. That's where it all went wrong yesterday. There we go, proof that long range fishing and casting accurately and baiting accurately can pay dividends. This one weighed in at 28 pound on the nose, and yeah, I thought I was gonna blank, to be honest. Got to pack up in a few hours, so it's nice to get one out to prove the whole exercise works. Happy days. Well, it's my first Brasenose fish in 7 years, so yeah, happy to catch, even though it's been a long time away from the water. It's good to turn up and catch a few, especially using the old technique of smashing them out to the centre, accurately baited on a nice little gravel spot that's obviously been fed on and must be a known feeding zone in this swim. So yeah, really happy. Let's let him go back, shall we?